Hello and welcome back, everybody. Welcome for the first time, if this is the first time you're joining us, but hopefully not, at the end of what has been, sort of a dizzyingly brilliant day. Just in terms of logistics, what a feat of organizing, corralling, and just fantastic panels all throughout the day. Unbelievably, there have been around 3,000 people joining today. So we have had a huge number of people who are clearly engaged with, interested in this idea. We've had people from Sweden, from Wales, from Catalonia, from Ayrshire, from Orkney, from India, from Bermuda, from Languedoc, from many, many places all over the world, which is testament to how many people care, how many people are engaged. And it's just been absolutely inspiring and thrilling. So we've got half an hour, which is not very long, but what we want to do in this session is try and reflect on and wrap up around what's been talked about today so that we can think about next steps. And what I want to do is to ask everyone who's listening now, all of you out there, while we're talking, as we're going along, I'd like you all to think about one thing, two things if you'd like, that you would like to see in a food diversity manifesto. We're going to use this as the basis of a working document. What we want to see is that if we've all come together and agreed that diversity is absolutely crucial, what do you think needs to happen at any scale? From the most intimate to the most global and structural, what needs to happen, one or two things. So if you do that, that would be great. What I'm going to do now very quickly is do a really, really fast roundup of the day, because many of you may not have been to all of the sessions. So I'm going to do a roundup of the day, and I've pulled from the amazing chat that's been going on one or two comments or questions that have come up in each session. I tell you, it was fiendishly hard to choose because there were so many good ideas. Again, we've got all those saved, so they will feed into the ideas and the next steps of this amazing conversation. So we started off the first session after the introductory one with Sheila Dillon, and she was a session about bread and grains. And the headline now, really, I think that came out of that, there were questions about kind of cost, affordability, access, taste and pleasure as absolutely key to driving change in what we eat and what we farm and what we make, and the importance of local and regional grain networks where millers and bakers have been working together to create models where affordable loaves with diverse grains are available to a maximum number of people. Those were the kind of real headlines. And a couple of comments that came, one from Caroline. She said, I interviewed farmers across the UK for a research project last year, and one of the main pieces of feedback received across the board was that a better understanding of production costs and a willingness to pay the real cost of food would be life-changing. There was also a great comment from Dan Westbury. Sustainable change always comes from the bottom up. We'll not achieve it. The necessary change is waiting around for policy. The policy has to be shaped around values and belief. And I pulled that out because I think this question of belief and values, societal values, is something that's gone all the way through the day. In the second session, Seeds, Alice Fowler did a fantastic job of chairing a really complicated subject. Headlines there, 75% have lost biogenetic diversity since the 1970s, huge loss of resilience, but huge amount of diversity possible if we, in the vegetables that we grow at scale. And a lot of encouragement for everyone to grow a good carrot, save some seeds, get out there, find your seed sovereignty bank. A really lovely message from Jason O'Rourke, and inspiring here. I'm a head teacher of a primary school in England. We have a very large organic kitchen garden and a polytunnel, which supports our food education lessons, as well as supplies our own school kitchen. A couple of years ago, we decided to just grow heritage and heirloom varieties so that our children could experience a wider variety of fruit and vegetables. The children's willingness to try different vegetables has greatly increased due to the wider varieties that they have been exposed to. So what a wonderful solution base to one of these problems. In the next session, Jimmy Woodrow chaired, was on soil. There was agreement from the panel that we need a much more nuanced conversation around the role of animals in terms of education about soil and pasture, that the role of the animal, the farmed animal, needs to be there in us understanding diversity and in driving diversity and soil health. Really the importance of grazing to plant diversity. And I loved this. There was this example of coon pigs who are fed a few apples and then left to forage. And one of the panelists, Sam, invited us to think about a world where farming to produce grain for farm animals ceases to exist. In this session, Nick Keppel-Palmer said, "This is fabulous. Retaining place-based value in the end products means that we can tell place stories to consumers who have been fundamentally disconnected from nature. Storytelling, and specifically stories of place, feels like a powerful weapon in shifting the sentiment around industrialized food, as well as getting people more connected to nature and biodiversity." In the next session around with chefs, Shane Holland chaired this, and the theme that came across here for me was this idea of chefs as ambassadors for diversity, that chefs have got this huge influence and potential to impact what people understand about food and what they know about food, not just customers, but also suppliers. There was a lovely message from Jane Cooper from Orkney. She said, "I can't emphasize enough what it means to farmers when some of our country's best chefs purchase the food that we produce." So that really important role. And Akwasi, one of the panelists, a restaurateur, said this beautiful thing. He said, people visiting his restaurants for him are not only guests, they are students. This idea of chefs being educators, I think, is crucial. Bryce Williams chaired a session on fish. The sentiment here was this idea that we've approached fishing with all the same systems of the global industrial farming system, with no attempt to consider the delicate balance of the oceans, that we catch around 100 species in British waters and really only eat 5, just a sort of madness. And the role of people involved in fish as educators to broaden people's willingness to try different species is going to be crucial. We had a comment here from Tim Spector, who we'll be talking to in a minute. He said, maybe we need an Uber app for local fish, where to source your local fish sounds like, and to understand your local fish sounds like a brilliant idea. Carolyn Steele said, a big problem in the UK around fish is a lack of knowledge, fear of bones, etc., etc. When it comes, this comes from industrialized food culture. The fish we like to eat are the ones that most resemble slabs of meat. Yes, yes, education. The next session on pulses and legumes, which was chaired by Nick Saltash, really they made a pretty big plea for, or a pretty much convincing case that actually pulses can save the world. They're the answer to so many of the problems that we see in terms of soil health, rich global heritage of these foods, absolutely crucial for our diet, and that sort of retaining or reinstating in much of the world the status of pulses is going to be really important. And in the chat, a lot of enthusiasm for people growing their own beans, trying to grow their own pulses. In the cities session, which is chaired by Richard McCarthy, cities came across as these places where we take risks and we embrace change. So real potential for cities to be the sort of engine of change. And in that panel, there was a agreed sort of pushback against this narrative that good food needs to be expensive, that in fact ultra-processed food is expensive in so many multiple ways, and that public institutions, schools, hospitals, etc., can be real drivers for food diversity. And really in this panel, joy and justice was the rallying cry of what the panel wanted. Rona Hotchkiss said, hello from Ayrshire in Scotland. For many years, our local hospital that sits in the middle of an Ayrshire potato field brought all of its potatoes from the south of England due to national procurement requirements. This was changed by ensuring that local sustainability benefits could be built into procurement specifications. It can be done. What a great example. Pat chaired the session on cheese, and that was phenomenal. He compressed 100 years of cheese making into 3 minutes, essentially the loss of thousands of cheesemakers in a century, resulting in the loss of an expression of place and many other things. The panel talks about how if we want farm sustainability, we need cheese making to make economic but also environmental sense, and that territorial cheese making is a crucial part in this. And also the to engender pleasure in shopping at specialist shops, not just supermarkets. It can't just be about convenience, this idea of pleasure and taste. Love to hear from Jane Stewart from Eastgate, the Eastgate Larder in Norfolk. She is reviving the medlar, growing and making chutney and jelly. So growing medlars, making chutney and jelly, all with the idea of artisan cheese, so bringing back an old variety. Anthony Powell said he has a dream, a huge disused supermarket filled with local producers sharing staff between stalls, convenient. Can we do it? And then in the final session, Bottling Biodiversity with Pete Brown, we heard about tequila, cider, perry, wine and beer, each one phenomenally complex, absolutely fascinating. And across all of these drinks, growers and makers trying to do very similar things, which is using sustainable crops, preserving the diversity of those crops, protecting different varieties, and really trying to create drinks which have expressions of place and cuisine and culture. It was absolutely mind-blowing. I couldn't believe that there are 10,000 varieties of grapevine. Every story was just wonderful. Chava, talking about tequila, made a very important point. I thought that diversity is hard to communicate, but people are very interested in it. And when they understand, they really want to drink diversity. There was a huge amount of chat, as you might expect, of people's favorite drinks and in fact what they were drinking as they were listening to the session. And finally, there was support in this session for creating a rainbow of diversity and a cornucopia of taste, which I think is something we can all get behind from this day. So that is a real whistle-stop roundup. I'm going to go now to, let's start with you, Dan, let's start with you, what you would add into the manifesto, one or two things quickly that need to happen.
Well, drawing on so many of the ideas and the themes that ran across the various sessions, number one, and I think this is also coming through in the chat room now, it's education. That taste education, which already exists in the UK, so a project in schools pioneered by B. Wilson and the head teacher that you mentioned, Jason O'Rourke. Really important, because I think in every session, from the grain session right through to the last one, the drinks, and particularly in cheese as well, the importance of taste, of appreciating flavor, the pleasure of food, and that as a gateway into diversity. So we've heard so much about resilience and food security and all those other important things, but interestingly, pleasure and flavor being a really powerful signal for diversity came across. So I would argue, and as would many, that we need compulsory taste education in our schools to train the next generation of people to be seekers of diversity, and people who will appreciate diversity and drive diversity into the future.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to go to Tim Benton, please.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Polly. Just building on Dan's point, I mean, I remember as a child being weaned off children's food and being repeatedly fed grapefruit at a weekend, and it was disgusting, and it was all the rest of that. But my parents saying it's time that you had adult food, it's time you had a diversity of food, and so on. And part of the trouble with our industrialized food systems is that we have a homogenized food, so everything is sweet, nothing is bitter, everything is more or less the same. And I think, my big point is that we are at a crossroads in time. We can allow the industrialized, globalized, commoditized, low diversity food system to steamroller us all into just accepting fuel, or we can create a fight back for diversity, for sustainability, and for nutrition. And to do that, we need to drive system change. And so the key question is how? Well, first of all, everybody ought to read this and buy it for their friends and their family and so on, because it's not just education in the sense of school or children, it's education in the sense of the wider society as a whole. So yes, we can eat more diversity, we can change our purchasing habits. That might be very, very good for us particularly, but a citizen as an activist has much more power than a citizen as a consumer. And we do tend to make, and I made this point this morning, we do tend to make the mistake that markets are driven by consumer choice. They are not. Markets are driven by the power within the system, and to levy the power within the system, we have to champion that. Talk diversity to your friends, talk diversity to your family, act as a local champion within your community, and drive the politics of system change, because we need to put the subsidies in the right place. I mean, we showed with some modelling a few years ago, and I will shut up, we showed with some modelling a few years ago that if we took all of the subsidies off global grain production, you know, the major commodities, and put them on fruit and vegetables, you would increase the availability of fruit and vegetables on a global basis. You would reduce the price. You would make ultra-processed food and industrial animal foods more expensive. And just by changing the subsidy structure, you would radically change the food environments, and you would change purchasing habits without having to go through this kind of navel gazing that it's behavioral change and we have to convince consumers to do things differently. So we can drive the politics of change. Might be an uphill struggle, but vote, discuss, champion, I would say. Over.
Fantastic, thank you. So from Dan, we've had this kind of real emphasis on education. From you, Tim, this idea of the citizen, let's all become citizen activists, use our agency, talk diversity, act diversity, push for diversity. Absolutely brilliant. Tim Spector.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said really about particularly education and trying to move us away from the supremacy of ultra-processed food, which does take lobbying, and you know we're moving very fast in the wrong direction, and all of these things are taking us away from diversity. But in order to get education, I think we've got to get the message out there health-wise that we need to move away from this 5 a day nonsense that nobody really follows anyway, to an idea of this aim of 30 a week, that if we can get that ingrained in more in more countries' mentality about how to think about food in terms of gut health and the health of the population, that would then enable manufacturers, and even on a small scale or large ones, to start advertising that on their produce. So they would say, you know, and we are starting to see this in things like breads, where there are certain companies saying, you know, we have 11 or 12 types of seed or grain in this bread, and this would then start to give it a health score or a gut-friendly score. And we start to encourage this whole process as we move away from the reductionism of calories, fats, sugars, etc. So I think if we did start to promote this 30 a week, it would help all the sectors we've talked about today, and it would allow the individual producers to really go out there and say, listen, I'm, you know, just by having different types of cider, you know, could count as 2 different items for your gut. So
I think that's going to be very popular, Tim. I think that's going to be universally taken up. Yeah, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, so that's what I think it should be a priority for our manifesto, is getting that message across. And you know, every individual out there should be proud to say why their product is diverse, and so you know it's good for our health. And if we all have that same message, that will have a knock-on effect.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Tim Spector. So getting that message out there. Dan, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just to amplify a couple of points, really. One is that clearly sometimes we think as individuals that we can't really make an impact. And there are these very, very powerful global forces and subsidies, etc., that just we seem really disconnected from, and really high politics that we don't feel in control of. But I think the point that Tim Benton made at the beginning of the day, that you know, all this large scale change really we're not going to get the food system that the planet needs and that we need unless diet also changes. So our individual actions and our choices are extremely important. So if we do become more active citizens and supporters of diversity, we can be part of the change, because to change the world, we need to change diets, clearly. A couple of other things. One idea that came up in the grain session was about the example of the Washington Grain Lab, which runs out of Washington State University, who through crop breeding with a bakery within as well. So everything is tasted. So it has to be delicious for it to be approved as a new landrace wheat, effectively. The idea there is that they're trying to create a regional grain economy where the money stays within the community, within the local regional farming system. And I think that was a really fascinating model we heard about. And then finally, just to fast forward to the drink session, Sarah Abbott said that recently the Italian government had announced a proclamation protecting old vines. So vineyards with some of the old genetic diversity that was disappearing, the government has intervened and has offered protection. So we're very familiar with, and it's extremely important that globally biodiversity of all kinds is protected, animal species and other forms of wild, wilderness, etc. Let's start to recognize the importance of some of these food systems, these more ancient genetic resources and these techniques and these methods, and give them the protection that they deserve, like a historic building. So I thought some really practical ideas have come through today.
Really practical ideas. And in fact, there are so many ideas on this chat. I sort of can't read them. They're sort of coming in so fast. And you can see there are some that are kind of big, sort of complex and important, which need to happen, and then things from as simple as try a new fruit and vegetable every day, or invite your neighbors around for a diversity food party, to national funding for school gardens, which will obviously be harder to achieve but not unachievable. So I think this kind of huge variety of ideas that we're seeing here, Dan, as well.
And also, I think that, and as Tim hinted at, Tim Spector hinted at as well, an Uber for buying fish. So I think, and I mentioned this in the book, of a farmer in southern China in the middle of nowhere being able to sell an endangered variety of rice because, and this farmer in his 70s showed me his phone, and on this phone he had WeChat, which is a bit WhatsApp and a bit eBay. And I think technology can connect us and bring us closer to producers and farmers, and we can create new networks as well and new supply chains. So that's why I find the future so interesting and exciting, because the application of technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just thinking about next steps, Dan, I mean, you must be absolutely thrilled. 3,000 people involved with today, all these incredible speakers, just a fantastic day. What do you think should happen next? What are you planning to do? Is this going to be an annual event? What do you want us all to go away and do? What are you going to do with this whole list? What are we going to do? Can you give us some ideas and direction?
The honest answer to most of those questions is I don't know.
What?
But I think one thing I realized as soon as the book came out, people wanted to have a conversation, that these stories were new to them. I think a lot of these issues, although well known for a century, really, for botanists and people interested in food security and crop breeders, this has been a story behind the scenes, really, even though it's so important to all of us. So I think the conversation needs to continue. And if food diversity can be part of that, then I'd love to bring it back next year, and for it to be starting more of a international conversation about what do we mean by food diversity, why should we care, and how can we save it if we do value it and think it's important to our future. So I think we're going to take lots of the ideas that have been put forward today. We are going to create something of a food manifesto. It will be on the website, and then watch this space. Let's see if we can do something next year, and for it to be an in-person event where people can actually experience more of this diversity as well. So what some of those wonderful cheeses we heard described, possibly even get Chava over from Mexico so we can all be trying some of this diverse, these agave spirits, for example. And, you know, let's get schools involved as well. I mean, let's get serious about getting children engaged with the story of where our food comes from, where it came from, and for them to be the future supporters and saviors of food diversity.
That sounds great, Dan. And I don't have any idea, any answers either, but I think, so the idea of this being annual sounds, I can see lots of people are getting behind that. But of course, I know that you didn't want this to just be annual. This is part of ongoing. I mean, it's about ongoing, isn't it? So how do we, I think we need to think about how we document and capture actions that happen between now and this time next year, which will be happening, how we collate around that, how we sort of have tenacity and energy and get energy and encouragement from all the energy that's been around today.
Yeah, I mean, I won't go into the full story, but the epilogue of the book is think like a Hadza. And you know, Tim Spector has spent time in Tanzania with me as well with the Hadza, and this idea of a closer connection to where our food comes from, and that our food really does depend on nature and biodiversity. The Hadza understand that because they need to, they depend on that biodiversity for their survival. We also depend on that for our survival, although we don't realize it most of the time. So we need to think more like a Hadza.
Yep. And there's a really good point here, just everyone to remember that if you've got a story or a forgotten rare food you want to share, tag at Eating to Extinction, or hashtag food diversity. So let's keep the conversation going on that way as well as thinking like and being like a Hadza. Unless Tim would like to jump in with any quick final points. No, you're all happy? Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody who has joined us today. It has been quite incredible, really the most wonderful day. Everybody here who's committed to try and understand this issue, to cherish it, to encourage thinking about diversity, valuing diversity. Just so important that everyone was here today. It does feel like the beginning of something, and I think it's going to sort of roll on, and it's got a huge sort of energy, so it's very exciting. I want to thank every panel. Go ahead, Dan.
I would just say a huge thank you to Fran and
yes,
Imogen,
I'm going to get that.
No, but I just, for me, because people don't realize somebody who's been driving the whole event and organizing things and making this happen, and also behind the scenes, the reason why it's so amazing that Fran's been doing this, she's in New Zealand. And she's been working through her night to make this happen. I don't know how much coffee she's been drinking. I don't know how diverse that coffee has been, but she's been soldiering on through the night to make this possible. So my personal thanks to Fran.
Yeah, I mean, it has been absolutely incredible, the organizing, the logistics, just pulling all this together. It's sort of a bit mind, but I'm not even sure she's a human. I think she's a machine. She's incredible. So yeah, amazing to Fran. Fantastic panelists. What an amazing array of passion, experience, expertise there has been today. And of course, huge thanks from us all to Dan for galvanizing, organizing, pulling this together, believing in it, writing this amazing book that everybody needs a copy of, just to reiterate again. What a brilliant thing. Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Go and have a glass
No,
of
it's been a real pleasure. And like I said at the beginning, I fell in love with the stories, and I knew they were important. And not only in writing the book, but actually today has made me realize why they are so important as well. So I just want people to fall in love with those stories as well. Thanks so much, Polly. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.